Sometimes the most broken hearts learn to beat with the greatest kindness. Sometimes those who have seen too much darkness become the light for others, lost in the storm. Torvin the Ironhand was once the most feared warrior of the northern clans. Now he lives alone in the frozen mountains, far from the violence that once defined him. On the worst night of winter, an elderly couple appears at his door, begging for shelter. The woman's plea is simple but desperate. What happens next changes everything. As Torvin kneels before them, offering warmth and honor, the old woman recognizes his face. This giant warrior is the wounded boy she once saved, the child everyone thought was dead. But what secret has Torvin been carrying all these years that will transform this chance meeting into something neither of them ever expected? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The timber hall stood like a defiant giant against the mountain's shoulder, its thick-hewn logs weathered to silver grey by decades of harsh winters. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a thin ribbon of life against the pewter sky that promised snow before nightfall. This was Torvin's sanctuary, built with his own hands in the years after he'd turned his back on the clans and their endless cycles of blood and glory. Inside, the great room stretched wide beneath heavy beams, lit by the golden dance of flames in a hearth large enough to roast a whole stag. Furs covered the plank, floors bare, wolf and elk that Torvin had taken not in sport but in necessity, honoring each creature with use of every part. The walls bore no weapons, no shields emblazoned with clan marks or battle honors. Instead, simple wooden shelves held the tools of his new life: carved bowls, woven baskets, pottery formed by his own massive hands that had once gripped sword hilts with deadly precision. The man himself sat beside the fire, working a piece of pine with a small knife, his movements deliberate and meditative. At first glance, Torvin the Ironhand remained an imposing figure, well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad as an ox yoke and arms thick with muscle earned through a lifetime of combat and honest labor. His hair, once golden like summer wheat, now carried streaks of silver at the temples. A beard, carefully trimmed, framed a face marked by old scars, a thin white line across his left cheekbone, another that pulled slightly at the corner of his mouth. But the eyes, those told the truest story. Once they had been the pale blue of winter ice, cold and calculating, the eyes of a man who could kill without hesitation when duty demanded it. Now they held depth, the quiet wisdom that comes only through great suffering and greater understanding. They were the eyes of someone who had walked through darkness and emerged, changed, tempered like steel in the forge of experience. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters with icy fingers. Torvin paused in his carving, lifting his head to listen. He knew these mountains intimately, could read their moods like an old mariner reads the sea. This storm would be fierce, the kind that could claim lives if travelers found themselves caught in the open. He set down his knife and moved to the window, pushing aside the heavy woolen curtain to peer into the gathering dusk. Snow had already begun to fall, fat flakes that caught the last light before disappearing into the darkness below. The wind carried that peculiar howl that spoke of a long, brutal night ahead. Torvin had seen storms like this claim entire parties of experienced hunters, men who knew these peaks as well as any living soul. On nights like this, even the wolves sought shelter in their dens. He returned to his chair, but the peaceful concentration was broken now. Something stirred in the depths of his memory, other storms, other nights when death walked close. He remembered huddling in a cave with his war brothers, sharing the last of their rations while enemy scouts prowled the darkness beyond. He remembered the morning after a great battle, when the snow had fallen so thick it covered the bodies of friend and foe alike, creating a white blanket of silence over the blood-soaked field. These were the memories that had driven him to this mountain, these ghosts that whispered in the quiet hours. Not cowardice, Torvin had never known fear in the way other men did, but weariness, soul-deep and profound. Weariness of the endless cycle of revenge and counter-revenge that defined clan life. Weariness of being the weapon others pointed at their enemies. Weariness of waking each morning, wondering which friends might be corpses before sunset. So he had walked away, not in anger or disgust, but in a kind of desperate hope that distance might bring peace. The clan elders had raged, called him oathbreaker and coward. Some of the young warriors had challenged him, eager to claim the honor of killing the legendary Ironhand. He had beaten them without drawing blade, using only his hands and the combat wisdom of 30 years. Then he had gathered his few possessions and walked into the wilderness, seeking something he could not name, but hoped he would recognize when he found it. That was 7 years ago. 7 years of solitude, of learning to live with only his own thoughts for company. 7 years of teaching his hands to create instead of destroy, of finding rhythm in simple tasks like splitting wood and tending his small garden. 7 years of discovering that the skills that made him deadly in battle, patience, attention to detail, the ability to read the smallest signs, served him well in this new life. He had not been entirely alone. Of course, occasionally travelers passed this way, traders taking the high route between settlements, hunting parties following elk herds, sometimes refugees, fleeing some clan dispute. Torvin offered shelter to all who asked, sharing his fire and food without question. Most were grateful but wary, recognizing something dangerous in his bearing, even if they didn't know his name. A few had recognized him, either by reputation or from his fighting days. These conversations were usually brief and uncomfortable, ending with hasty departures at first light. The irony was not lost on him. He had sought to escape his reputation, only to find that legends followed a man like his own shadow. The more he tried to forget the warrior called Ironhand, the more that identity seemed to define him. Even here, in his self-imposed exile, he remained trapped by who he had been. Tonight felt different, though he could not say why. Perhaps it was simply the severity of the storm, or maybe something deeper, an intuition honed by years of reading battlefields and enemy intentions. Change was coming. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the flames seemed to dance more urgently in the hearth, in the peculiar quality of the wind that spoke of more than weather. Torvin rose and moved through his evening routine with practiced efficiency. He banked the fire to burn long and slow, checked that his stores of wood were within easy reach, and secured the shutters against the wind. The hall was well built, designed to withstand the worst the mountains could offer. He had learned hard lessons about winter survival during his warrior years, nights when proper shelter meant the difference between life and death for him and his men. As he prepared for bed, Torvin caught his reflection in the polished metal of a water basin. The face that looked back seemed older tonight, marked by lines of solitude and contemplation. This was not the face of Torvin the Ironhand, the battle-mad berserker whose charge could break enemy shield walls. This was the face of a man who had chosen peace over glory, silence over the roar of crowds chanting his name. Yet beneath the changes, beneath the silver in his hair and the wisdom in his eyes, something of the old warrior remained. It was there in the set of his shoulders, the unconscious way he positioned himself to observe all approaches to his sanctuary. It was there in the calloused hands that, despite years of gentle work, still moved with the deadly precision of long training. Some things, once learned, could never be entirely unlearned. The storm struck with full force just as he settled into his chair one last time before sleep. The wind howled like a pack of starving wolves, driving snow against the windows with enough force to rattle the heavy frames. Inside, the hall remained warm and secure, a bubble of light and life in the vast darkness of the mountain night. Torvin listened to the storm's fury and felt a deep satisfaction in his preparations. Whatever the night might bring, he was ready. His sanctuary would hold, the fire would burn until morning, and if any soul was foolish or desperate enough to be caught out in this weather, they would find warm welcome at his door. He had no way of knowing that this simple act of faith, keeping his door unbarred against the storm, would change the course of his carefully ordered life forever. The pounding came near midnight, barely audible above the storm's roar, but unmistakably human, desperate, rhythmic, the sound of someone fighting for their very life. Torvin was on his feet before his mind fully processed the sound, moving toward the door with the fluid grace of a man whose survival had once depended on instant reaction to the unexpected. He paused with his hand on the heavy wooden bar that secured the entrance. The wind shrieked around the eaves, driving snow so hard it sounded like handfuls of grain thrown against the walls. No sensible person would be out in this weather. But then, desperation had a way of making people attempt the impossible. The knocking came again, weaker now, but persistent. A woman's voice, nearly lost in the storm's fury. "Please, shelter, we are dying." Torvin lifted the bar and pulled the door inward, immediately feeling the storm's icy teeth bite at his face. Snow swirled into the hall like living smoke, and for a moment he could see nothing but white chaos. Then two figures stumbled forward, more falling than walking, and collapsed just inside the threshold. The woman was elderly, her hair white as the snow that clung to her dark woolen cloak. Her face was pale with cold, lips tinged blue, but her eyes, sharp and intelligent, fixed on his with desperate hope. Beside her, an older man struggled to remain upright, his breath coming in short gasps, ice crystals frosting his beard. Torvin slammed the door against the wind and dropped to his knees beside them. "Easy now," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for such a large man. "You are safe. The storm cannot reach you here." The woman tried to speak, but could only shiver violently. Hypothermia. Torvin recognized the signs immediately. He had lost men to cold before, knew how quickly it could claim even the strongest warrior. Without hesitation, he scooped the woman into his arms and carried her to the hearth, her weight no more burden than a child's to his powerful frame. "Hallgrim," she managed to whisper, turning her head toward her companion. "I have him," Torvin assured her, returning for the man who was already struggling to stand. He helped the elderly fellow to the fire, noting the quiet dignity in his bearing despite his obvious exhaustion. The woman's cloak was soaked through, heavy with ice and snow. Torvin found dry furs and wrapped them both, then ladled warm broth from a pot that hung beside the hearth. "Drink slowly," he instructed, holding the wooden bowl to the woman's lips. "Let the warmth find you gradually." As the immediate crisis passed and color began to return to their faces, Torvin got his first clear look at his unexpected guests. The woman was perhaps 60 winters, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and respect. Her clothing, beneath the traveling cloak, was well made, but practical, the garb of someone who spent their life moving between settlements. Her hands, now wrapped around the warm bowl, were those of a healer scarred from herb gathering, stained with plant dyes, but gentle and sure in their movements. The man called Hallgrim was older, perhaps 65, with silver hair and a carefully braided beard. He said little, but his eyes missed nothing, watching Torvin with the assessment of someone long accustomed to judging character quickly. There was strength in him still, despite his years, and a protective alertness whenever his gaze shifted to the woman. "I am Ragnar," the woman said when she could speak without shivering. "This is my companion, Hallgrim. We are in your debt, stranger." "I am Torvin," he replied simply, "and you owe me nothing. This is what any decent person would do." At the sound of his name, something flickered in Ragnar's eyes, not recognition exactly, but a stirring of memory, like a half-remembered song. She studied his face more carefully, taking in the scars, the silver-streaked hair, the powerful build that marked him as a warrior despite his gentle manner. "We were traveling to the settlement at Ironmere." Hallgrim spoke for the first time, his voice rough with cold and exhaustion. "The weather turned faster than we expected. We should have made shelter hours ago. But," he shook his head, "pride makes fools of old men. The storm caught many by surprise, Torvin said, adding more wood to the fire. Even experienced mountain folk would struggle in this. You were wise to seek shelter when you did. Ragnar continued to watch him, her healer's eyes noting details others might miss. The way he moved with unconscious grace, despite his size. The old scars that spoke of violence survived. The careful, almost ritual way he tended the fire and prepared food, as if these simple tasks held deep meaning for him. Torvin, she repeated, as if testing the name. An unusual name. Northern clan. Once, he replied, settling into his chair across from them. Long ago. Something in his tone suggested the subject was closed, but Ragnar's mind was working, pulling at threads of memory. She had known many warriors in her lifetime, had tended their wounds and listened to their stories. This man's presence felt familiar in a way she couldn't place, not his appearance, for she was certain they had never met as adults, but something deeper, something about the quality of his attention, the way he held himself even in relaxation. "You live alone here?" Hallgrim asked, gesturing to the well-appointed but clearly solitary hall. 7 years now, Torvin confirmed. The mountains suit me. They ask no questions and judge no one for their past. A hermit warrior, Ragnar murmured, and Torvin's head snapped up at her words. Few would have made that connection so quickly. You have a healer's eye, he said carefully. 40 years of practice, she replied. I have tended many warriors. Some seek isolation after they have seen too much. Some find peace in simple work. Her gaze moved to his hands, noting the calluses that spoke of woodcraft and honest labor alongside the fighter's scars. Some learn to create after a lifetime of destroying. Torvin was quiet for a long moment, studying this perceptive woman who seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed solitude. You speak as one who understands such things. War touches everyone, Ragnar said softly. Warriors carry the obvious scars, but healers we carry the knowledge of what violence truly costs. We see the wounds that do not heal, the spirits that break along with the bodies. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the hall, a different kind of atmosphere was building. 3 people, strangers an hour ago, were beginning to recognize kindred spirits, souls shaped by conflict and loss, each seeking their own form of peace. As the night deepened and the initial crisis of survival passed, Ragnar found herself studying Torvin's face in the firelight. There was something maddeningly familiar about his features, something that nagged at the edges of her memory, like a word on the tip of her tongue. She had seen those eyes before, not pale with wisdom as they were now, but burning with fever and pain. Not in this weathered face, but in the features of someone much younger. A boy's face, she realized with dawning shock. A wounded boy she had nursed back from death's edge many years ago in a time of great violence and sorrow. A boy everyone believed had died in the chaos that followed, his body lost among so many others. But that was impossible. That child would be dead now, claimed by the violence that had already marked him so young. Yet as she watched this giant of a man tend the fire with gentle hands, she could not shake the growing certainty that the impossible had somehow become real. The boy she had saved, the boy she had mourned for 25 years, was sitting across from her, very much alive. Ragnar's hands trembled as she reached for the worn leather pouch at her belt, not from cold now, but from the weight of recognition flooding through her. The healing bag had traveled with her for 40 years, its surface polished smooth by countless hands, its contents a testament to a lifetime spent mending what violence had broken. You keep staring at me as if you've seen a ghost, Torvin observed quietly, his voice holding a note of gentle concern. Perhaps I have, Ragnar whispered, her fingers working the familiar ties of her medicine bag. Inside, beneath packets of dried herbs and small clay vials, lay memories as carefully preserved as any remedy. Tell me, Torvin, have you always lived by that name? Torvin went still, the way a wolf freezes when it catches a hunter's scent. Why do you ask? Instead of answering, Ragnar began to speak, her voice taking on the cadence of someone sharing a sacred story. 25 years ago, in the settlement of Bleakstone, raiders came in the night. The Ironwood clan, they called themselves, though they showed no honor worthy of such a name. They killed the men, took the women and children as slaves, burned everything they could not carry. Hallgrim shifted in his chair, recognizing the tone that meant Ragnar was about to share something long held close to her heart. He had heard pieces of this story before, but never the whole truth. "I was the settlement's healer then," Ragnar continued, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "When the smoke cleared and the dead were counted, I found something the raiders had missed: a boy, barely 14 winters, hidden in a grain cellar. He had been wounded trying to defend his family. A sword cut along his ribs, deep enough to kill if infection set in. A blow to his head that left him unconscious for 3 days. Torvin's breathing had gone shallow, his massive hands clenched in his lap. Many boys died in clan raids. Many families were destroyed." "Yes," Ragnar agreed, "but this boy was different. When he finally woke, delirious with fever, he kept saying the same name over and over again, not his own name, but the name of his little sister. 'Save Astrid,' he begged. They took Astrid. The name hit Torvin like a physical blow. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he was 14 again, helpless and broken, watching his world burn around him. His real name was Bjorn," Ragnar continued softly. "Bjorn Eriksson. His father was a carpenter. His mother wove the finest cloth in 3 settlements. They had a little daughter named Astrid, who could not have been more than 7 winters old. Golden hair like her brother's before the fever burned it away." "Stop," Torvin whispered, but there was no force behind the word. "I tended his wounds for 6 weeks. Ragnar pressed on, her voice gentle but relentless. Cleaned the infection from his cuts, fed him broth when he was too weak to hold a spoon, sat beside his bed during the fever dreams when he relived that horrible night again and again. He was so young, so broken not just in body, but in spirit. The guilt of surviving when his family had not was eating him alive." Torvin opened his eyes, and Ragnar saw the young boy's pain still there, buried beneath decades of carefully constructed armor. "The raiders had taken his sister with the other children. He begged me to help him find her, to rescue her somehow. But I was just a healer, and he was barely strong enough to stand." "What happened to him?" Hallgrim asked quietly, though he suspected he already knew. "Men came looking for survivors," Ragnar said. "Not to help, but to finish what the raiders had started. There were rumors that some children had escaped, and the Ironwood clan wanted no witnesses to grow up seeking revenge. I hid the boy Bjorn in the root cellar beneath my house, told the searchers that all the children were dead or taken." Torvin rose abruptly and moved to the window, staring out into the storm as if he could see through the swirling snow to that distant, terrible night. "And then I helped him escape, gave him what little coin I had, pointed him toward the eastern settlements where distant relatives might take in a refugee. He chose a new name for his new life, Torvin," he said, after some hero from an old story his father used to tell. Ragnar's voice broke slightly. "I never saw him again, never knew if he lived or died, though I prayed to the gods for his safety every night for years." The healing pouch slipped from Ragnar's lap as she reached out toward the silent figure at the window. "I searched for word of his sister Astrid, used every contact I had among traders and travelers. I found traces. She had been sold to a family far to the north, but by the time I learned this, 3 years had passed. The trail was cold, the family had moved on, and there was no way to track them further." "She would be 32 now," Torvin said without turning around. "If she still lives—" "You never stopped looking for her, did you?" Ragnar asked. Torvin's shoulders sagged beneath an invisible weight. "For 10 years I searched. Every settlement, every trading post, every slave market I could find. I became a warrior not for glory or clan honor, but because warriors could travel far and ask questions that others could not. I built my reputation, earned my place among the fierce fighters, All so I could continue searching for a little girl with golden hair who probably didn't even remember her brother's face. Is that why they called you Ironhand? Hallgrim asked. Because you were searching for something you could never grasp? No, Torvin replied, finally turning back to face them. They called me Ironhand because I learned to feel nothing when I killed. When rage and grief burned out of me, what was left was cold as winter iron. I could end lives without hesitation, without mercy, because I had already died inside the night I failed to save her. Ragnar rose and moved toward him, her healer's instincts overriding all other concerns. You were a child. There was nothing you could have done. I could have died with them, Torvin said simply. It would have been cleaner, more honest. And then who would have remembered their names? Ragnar challenged. Who would have carried their love forward into the world? Death is not always the answer to grief, Bjorn. He flinched at the name he had not heard spoken aloud in 25 years. That boy died in the cellar beneath your house. Only Torvin walked out into the morning light. Perhaps, Ragnar said, reaching into her healing pouch one more time. But some things survive even death. Her fingers found what they sought, and she drew out a small object wrapped in soft cloth. As she unfolded the fabric, Torvin's breath caught in his throat. There, nestled in her palm, was a small wooden carving, a raven with outstretched wings, roughly hewn but unmistakably made by a child's hands. You carved this while you were recovering, Ragnar said softly. Made it from a piece of scrap wood with my healing knife. You said ravens were clever birds, survivors who could find life even in the darkest places. You said you wanted to be like them. Torvin stared at the carving, his vision blurring with tears he had not shed in decades. I remember. I gave it to you as payment for your kindness. I have carried it with me ever since, Ragnar said, pressing the wooden raven into his palm. A reminder that sometimes, when everything seems lost, life finds a way to endure. Hallgrim had remained silent through Ragnar's revelation, but now he stood slowly, his weathered hands gripping the carved walking staff that had supported him through countless journeys. The oak was ancient, older than memory, and the protective runes carved along its length caught the firelight like silver threads. It was more than a tool, it was a symbol of the path he had chosen to walk beside this remarkable woman. You wonder who I am in this tale, Hallgrim said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard, despite speaking rarely. I am not Ragnar's husband, though many assume so. I am her guardian, her companion on the road, and the keeper of her stories. Torvin wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the wooden raven still clutched in his palm. How did you come to travel together? 5 years after she saved you, Hallgrim began, settling back into his chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints had endured many hard winters. I was a warrior myself then, serving the Thornhill clan. We were pursuing raiders who had struck our settlement, following their trail into the borderlands where no single clan held sway. Ragnar smiled softly at the memory. I was tending a family of refugees those raiders had wounded and left for dead. A mother and 2 children, badly hurt but alive. Hallgrim's war party found my camp just as I was running out of supplies. She was alone in the wilderness, Hallgrim continued, with nothing but her healing knowledge and a determination that put our warriors to shame. She had been tracking those same raiders for 3 days, not to fight them, but to help whoever they left broken in their wake. I had learned by then that violence left a trail of suffering, Ragnar explained. If I could not prevent the raids, at least I could follow behind and mend what could be mended. Torvin studied the older man's face, noting the way Hallgrim's eyes softened when he looked at Ragnar. You gave up clan life to follow her. I had lost my wife and children to raiders 2 years earlier, Hallgrim said simply. My sword felt heavy in my hands after that, weighted down with futility. What good is a warrior's strength if it cannot protect what matters most? When I saw Ragnar tending those wounded refugees, asking nothing in return, I recognized something I had thought was lost forever. What was that? Purpose, Hallgrim replied. Clean purpose, untainted by revenge or politics or clan honor. She was not fighting for territory or glory. She was simply trying to heal a broken world, one person at a time. Ragnar reached over and touched Hallgrim's weathered hand. He convinced his war leader to let him escort the refugees to safety. But when we reached the next settlement, he did not return to his clan. I asked if I could travel with her, Hallgrim said. Told her the roads were dangerous for a healer traveling alone, but truthfully, I needed her wisdom more than she needed my protection. He has been my companion ever since, Ragnar said warmly. My protector when protection was needed, my friend when friendship was required, and my conscience when the weight of so much suffering threatened to break my spirit. Torvin looked between them, seeing the deep bond that years of shared purpose had created. You have traveled together for 20 years? 20 years of following the paths that violence carves through the world, Hallgrim confirmed. We go where the need is greatest, stay until the immediate crisis passes, then move on. Sometimes we arrive too late to save lives, but we can always ease pain. Sometimes we can prevent violence before it begins by treating the wounds that drive men to cruelty. It is not an easy life, Ragnar admitted. We own nothing but what we can carry. We sleep under stars more often than roofs. We see humanity at its worst, day after day. But also at its best, Hallgrim added. In every settlement, we find people willing to help strangers. In every tragedy, we discover acts of courage and selflessness. For every person who turns away from suffering, we meet 3 who step forward to aid however they can. Torvin moved back to his chair, cradling the wooden raven like a talisman. And now you are growing old. The roads must be harder than they once were. Much harder, Ragnar acknowledged. This winter has been particularly difficult. We have been traveling since autumn, following reports of plague in the northern settlements. The sickness was contained, but the work was exhausting. Which brings us to why we were caught in this storm, Hallgrim said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. We were not simply traveling to Ironmere, we were looking for someone. Torvin's head snapped up. Looking for who? Ragnar and Hallgrim exchanged a meaningful glance, and Torvin saw a lifetime of wordless communication pass between them. These two had shared dangers and sorrows that most people could not imagine, had learned to read each other's thoughts as clearly as spoken words. For you, Ragnar said quietly. We were looking for you. That's impossible, Torvin protested. You thought I was dead. You said so yourself. 3 months ago, we were treating wounded soldiers from a border skirmish near the Raven Shallow, Hallgrim explained. One of them, a veteran sergeant, told us about a hermit warrior living alone in these mountains. A giant of a man, he said, with silver in his hair and scars that spoke of many battles. Many hermit warriors live in the mountains, Torvin said, but his voice lacked conviction. This one was called Ironhand, Ragnar continued. The sergeant said he had recognized the man from his fighting days, though the hermit gave no sign of remembering his old reputation. Said this warrior had once been the most feared fighter in the northern clans, but had vanished years ago, without explanation. Torvin was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications. You traveled into these mountains in winter, risking your lives, because you thought you might find a boy you saved 25 years ago? I have thought of you every day since you left my house, Ragnar said simply. Wondered if you lived, if you found peace, if the wounds I helped heal had truly mended or simply scarred over. When I heard that description, I knew in my heart it was you. But why? Torvin asked. Why risk so much for a ghost from your past? Ragnar looked into the fire, her face showing every one of her 60 years. Because I am dying, Bjorn. This winter will likely be my last. And before I go, I needed to know if saving you was worth the life I chose to live afterward. Torvin stared at Ragnar, her words settling into his mind like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything he thought he understood about this night. Dying? The word came out, as barely a whisper. "The wasting sickness," Ragnar said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "It began last spring, weakness at first, then pain that no amount of my own remedies could touch. I have seen it before in others. The body simply decides its time has come." Hallgrim's knuckles were white where they gripped his staff, but his voice remained steady. "She has, perhaps, until the spring thaw. Maybe less. The journey here has been harder on her than she admits." Torvin looked down at the simple iron bracelet circling his wrist, a piece he had forged himself in the early days of his exile. It was rough work, unadorned, but it represented something precious to him, proof that hands trained only for destruction could learn to create. He twisted it absently, a habit he had developed when deep in thought. "You should have stayed in a settlement," he said finally. "Found a place to rest, to be comfortable." "Comfortable?" Ragnar laughed, but there was no bitterness in it. "I have spent 40 years sleeping on hard ground and eating whatever the road provided. Comfort is not what I seek in my final months." "Then what do you seek?" "Understanding," she replied. "I need to know if the path I chose was the right one. If the boy I saved grew into a man worth saving. If the life I spent helping others actually mattered, or if I was simply postponing inevitable suffering." Torvin rose and began to pace, his large frame casting moving shadows on the walls. "You saved my life. Without you, I would have died in that cellar, infected and forgotten. How can you question whether that mattered? Because of what you became afterward," Ragnar said gently. "I sent a wounded boy into the world, and he became one of the most feared killers of his generation. How many men died by your hand, Bjorn? How many families mourned because of choices you made?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, but Torvin heard no judgment in her tone, only the genuine need to understand the consequences of her compassion. "More than I can count," he admitted, stopping his pacing to face her directly. "In my first year as Torvin, I joined the Blackstone clan as a common warrior. I told them I was seeking revenge for my murdered family, which was true enough. They appreciated that kind of hunger." "And you found your revenge?" "I found the Ironwood raiders who had destroyed Bleakstone," Torvin said, his voice growing distant with memory. "It took 3 years, but I tracked down every man who had participated in that raid. I killed them all, one by one, until none remained to remember my sister's face." Hallgrim leaned forward. "Did it bring you peace?" "No," Torvin said simply. "It brought me nothing but a reputation for being very good at killing, and once a man earns such a reputation, others seek him out. Clan leaders offered me gold to eliminate their enemies. Young warriors challenged me to prove their worth. I became what the world expected me to be, a weapon to be pointed at whatever needed destroying." "But you were more than that," Ragnar insisted. "Even then, there must have been something of the boy I knew still inside you." Torvin moved to the hearth and selected a piece of wood from the pile beside it. As he fed the fire, sparks danced upward like tiny stars seeking the sky. "I tried to be," he said. "I followed a code of sorts, never killed innocent people, never attacked the defenseless, always honored my agreements. I told myself that made me better than common murderers." "It did," Hallgrim said firmly. "I have known many warriors, and few maintained any honor once they tasted real power." "Honor?" Torvin turned the iron bracelet around his wrist again. "I once slaughtered 12 men in a tavern because their leader spoke disrespectfully about a woman who reminded me of my sister. I told myself it was about honor, but really, I was just looking for an excuse to feed the rage that never left me." "You were young and hurt," Ragnar said. "Young men make poor choices when they carry too much pain." "I was 28 when that happened," Torvin countered. "Old enough to know better. Old enough to choose a different path." "Then why didn't you?" she asked. Torvin was quiet for a long moment, considering how to put something into words that he had never fully examined himself. "Because being Torvin the Ironhand was easier than being Bjorn Eriksson. Bjorn was a broken boy who had failed his family. Torvin was feared and respected. People stepped aside when he walked by. They listened when he spoke. They never asked about his past or questioned his right to exist. But the killing never satisfied you, Ragnar observed. No, Torvin agreed. With every life I took, I felt more empty inside. It was as if each death carved away another piece of whatever humanity you had helped me preserve. After 15 years of that life, I looked in a mirror and saw a stranger scarred, grey-haired, with eyes like winter ice. I realized I had become exactly what the raiders who destroyed my family had been. The admission seemed to cost him something precious. He sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 49 years. "That was when you left," Hallgrim said. "It was not a question." "That was when I ran away," Torvin corrected. "I told everyone it was about finding peace, but really, I was terrified that if I stayed in that life one more day, there would be nothing left of the boy you saved. Nothing worth preserving." Ragnar studied his face in the firelight, seeing past the scars and silver hair to the wounded child she remembered. "And have you found him again?" "That boy." Torvin looked down at the iron bracelet, remembering the day he had forged it, his first attempt at creating something beautiful instead of destructive. The metal had fought him, bent wrong, cracked under his inexperienced hammer. But eventually he had learned its nature, worked with it instead of against it, and produced something simple but honest. "Some days," he said, "when I am working with my hands, making something useful, I remember what it felt like to have hope. When I help a lost traveler or share my fire with someone in need, I feel connected to something larger than my own pain. But other days, I hear the wind in the mountains and remember the sound men make when they are dying. I see shadows move in the forest and reach for a sword that is no longer there. The warrior in me never truly sleeps, he just waits for something to wake him. Perhaps that is not entirely a bad thing," Ragnar said thoughtfully. Ragnar's hand moved to the small silver locket at her throat, a gesture so automatic it seemed unconscious. The pendant was simple, tarnished with age, but the way her fingers traced its edges spoke of countless repetitions of this same motion. Inside, Torvin knew, without seeing, would be images of faces that time and violence had stolen from her. "You speak of the cost of being a warrior," Ragnar said softly, "but you are not the only one who has paid prices for the choices violence forced upon us." She opened the locket with practiced ease, revealing 2 small painted portraits, a man with kind eyes and a girl of perhaps 12 winters, both rendered with the careful detail of someone who feared forgetting a single beloved feature. "My husband, Einar," she said, tilting the locket so the firelight caught the tiny paintings. "And our daughter, Freydis. They died in the same raid where I found you." Torvin felt the air leave his lungs as if he had been struck. "The same raid? But you said," "I said the raiders killed the men and took the women and children," Ragnar continued, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I did not say I was spared because I was lucky, or clever, or brave. I was spared because I was not there." Hallgrim shifted in his chair, his weathered face showing the pain of a story heard many times but never rendered less devastating by repetition. "I had travelled to the next settlement to tend a difficult birth," Ragnar explained. "A woman was dying in labour, and they needed my skills. I planned to be gone 3 days at most. Einar kissed me goodbye and promised to keep Freydis safe until I returned. When you came back," Torvin began, but could not finish the question. "When I came back, there was nothing left but smoke and corpses," Ragnar said. "I found Einar in our doorway, where he had died trying to defend our home. He had taken 3 raiders with him, a carpenter who had never held a weapon in anger, fighting like a berserker to protect his child. And Freydis, gone with the other children, 12 years old, with her father's gentle nature and her mother's healing hands. She could sing like a lark and grew the most beautiful flowers in the settlement." Ragnar's voice broke slightly. She was terrified of spiders, but brave enough to help me set broken bones without flinching. The locket snapped closed with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "You searched for her," Torvin said, understanding beginning to dawn. "For 15 years, Ragnar confirmed. Every settlement, every trading post, every whisper of children sold in distant markets. I followed every lead, no matter how slim or how far it took me from any place I might call home. Did you find her?" Ragnar was quiet for so long that Torvin thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of long-carried sorrow. "I found what became of her," she said. "The family who bought her treated her well enough, fed her, clothed her, did not abuse her. But they worked her like a servant, and when she grew old enough to be useful in other ways, they sold her to a man who wanted a wife. She lived, then," Hallgrim said gently. "That is something." "She lived until the fever took her in her 23rd year, Ragnar continued. "By the time I found the settlement where she had died, she had been in the ground for 2 seasons. The man she had been forced to marry spoke of her kindly, said she had been a good wife, obedient and skilled at healing minor ailments." Torvin closed his eyes, imagining a frightened 12-year-old girl growing into a woman who never saw her mother again, never knew that someone had spent 15 years searching for her. "She had children?" he asked quietly. "2 sons," Ragnar said, and for the first time a note of warmth crept into her voice. "The older one had her eyes, green as spring grass. The younger one had her laugh. I could hear it in his voice when he spoke of her. You met your grandsons." "I told them who I was," Ragnar said. "Explained how their mother and I were connected. They were good boys, grown into good men. They invited me to stay, to make a home with their families." "But you didn't," Torvin observed. "How could I?" Ragnar asked. "What right did I have to appear in their lives after their mother was dead, claiming a connection I had failed to maintain? My daughter lived and died as a stranger to me, and I had learned nothing of who she became in those years of separation." "You had learned that she survived," Hallgrim pointed out. "That the child you mourned grew up to have children of her own, that some echo of her continues in the world." "Yes," Ragnar agreed. "But I had also learned the true cost of violence, not just the immediate deaths and destruction, but the ripples that spread outward for generations. My daughter died not knowing her mother's love. Her children grew up with no knowledge of their grandmother's healing wisdom, and I spent the best years of my life chasing shadows instead of helping the living." She looked directly at Torvin, her healer's eyes seeing straight through to his deepest fears. "When I chose to become a wandering healer after losing my family, I told myself it was noble that I would dedicate my life to helping others in honor of those I could not save. But truthfully, it was easier to tend strangers' wounds than to face the emptiness of a life without the people who had given it meaning." "There is no shame in that," Torvin said firmly. "You saved lives, eased suffering, just as you saved lives by ending the men who destroyed your family," Ragnar interrupted. "We both found ways to turn our pain into purpose. But I need to understand if that purpose was real, or if we simply created elaborate ways to avoid healing our own wounds." Torvin twisted his iron bracelet again, thinking of the years he had spent in this mountain sanctuary, telling himself he was finding peace, while really just hiding from the consequences of his choices. "You think we are the same," he said finally. "2 people who lost everything and spent their lives running from the emptiness. I think we are 2 people who forgot how to live for ourselves," Ragnar replied, "who found meaning only in service to others because we believed we deserved nothing more." Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, its furious howling fading to a steady whisper of wind and snow. But inside the hall, the real tempest was just beginning, the kind that comes when long-buried truths finally surface, demanding to be faced at last. Ragnar reached inside her traveling cloak with hands that trembled slightly, not from cold or illness, but from the weight of what she was about to reveal. When her fingers found what they sought, she drew out an object wrapped in soft, undyed wool. The fabric fell away to reveal a small wooden carving, its surface worn smooth by countless touches over the years. It was a raven, wings spread in flight, roughly carved, but unmistakably crafted with love. Even weathered by decades, the bird seemed to possess a spirit of its own, as if it might take wing at any moment. Torvin stared at the familiar carving, his world tilting on its axis. "That's impossible. I gave you a raven, yes, but this is not the same one." "No," Ragnar agreed softly, cradling the wooden bird in her palms. "This one is different, but it was carved by the same hands, in the same style, with the same small knife." "I don't understand," Torvin whispered, though a terrible certainty was beginning to bloom in his chest. "When I found my daughter's village, when I learned of her death, I stayed longer than I intended," Ragnar continued, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone sharing a long-guarded secret. "Her sons told me stories of their mother, of the woman she had become. They said she was gifted at woodworking, unusual for a woman, but she claimed her father had taught her the skill before she was taken." Hallgrim leaned forward, understanding flooding his weathered features. "The man who raised her, he taught her carpentry." "No," Ragnar said, shaking her head. "Her husband said she already knew the craft when she arrived, said she could carve figures that seemed almost alive, though she rarely spoke of where she had learned such skills." Torvin's hands were shaking now, the implications crashing over him like a mountain avalanche. Are you saying that Freydis was—" "I am saying that my daughter grew up calling herself by another name," Ragnar said gently. "The family who bought her named her Astrid, after their own dead daughter. They thought it would help her forget her past, make her more accepting of her new life." The wooden raven seemed to pulse with significance in Ragnar's hands, a small messenger carrying impossible news across 25 years of separation and grief. "Astrid," Torvin breathed, the name he had whispered in 10,000 prayers, the golden-haired child who had haunted his dreams. "My sister was your daughter. The children of Bleakstone were scattered to many different buyers," Ragnar explained, tears flowing freely now. "In the chaos after the raid, I had no way to know which children belonged to which families. I found you in your family's cellar, but I never learned the names of your parents, never knew you had a sister among the taken." "She was alive," Torvin said, his voice hollow with wonder and devastating loss. "All those years I searched for her, and she was alive. She was alive, and she remembered. You," Ragnar continued, reaching into her cloak again. This time she withdrew a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. "Her sons gave me this when I told them who I was. They said their mother had kept it hidden away, that she only brought it out when she thought no one was watching." With infinite care, Ragnar unwrapped the bundle to reveal its contents. A child's wooden sword, no longer than a man's hand, carved with the same attention to detail as the raven. Scratched into the blade in runes that had been traced and retraced until they were worn deep into the wood was a single word: Bjorn. Torvin reached for the tiny sword with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "I made this for her when she was 6 years old. Told her that if I wasn't there to protect her, she would have to learn to protect herself. She carried it with her through slavery, through marriage, through motherhood," Ragnar said. "Her husband found it after she died, hidden in a box with her few personal possessions. He said she sometimes held it when she was sad, though she never told him why. She remembered me," Torvin whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "After all those years, all that pain, she still remembered her brother. She not only remembered you," Ragnar said, producing one final item from her seemingly infinite supply of treasures, a piece of bark with writing scratched into its surface in charcoal. "She wrote about you. Her eldest son found this among her things after the fever took her. He said there were others like it, but they crumbled away over time. Torvin took the bark with hands that could barely hold it steady. The writing was rough, formed by someone who had learned letters late in life, but the words were clear enough. My brother Bjorn had hands like father, could make anything from wood. He carved me a sword and promised to teach me to fight when I was older. I dream sometimes he is still looking for me, that one day he will find me and take me home. I tell my boys about their uncle who was brave like the ravens, who could make beautiful things and keep them safe. If the gods are kind, we will meet again in the next world, and I will show him his nephews, and he will be proud. Torvin read the words 3 times before their meaning penetrated the shock that had numbed his mind. When understanding finally came, it brought with it a grief so profound that it seemed to hollow out his chest, leaving him gasping for air that would not come. She died thinking I had abandoned her, he said, the words barely audible. She died knowing you loved her, Ragnar corrected firmly. The boys said she spoke of you often in her final days, when the fever made her remember things from childhood. She told them that having a brother who cared enough to carve her toys was the greatest treasure of her early life. But I failed her, Torvin protested. I searched everywhere, asked everyone, followed every rumor. How did I miss her? How did I never find any trace of where she had gone? Because she was sold under a different name to people who lived far from any place you would think to look, Holgrim said gently. Because the world is vast, and even the most determined searcher cannot be everywhere at once. Ragnar leaned forward, pressing both the wooden raven and the tiny sword into Torvin's hands. But you never stopped looking. Even when you became Torvin the Ironhand, even in your darkest moments as a killer, part of you was still the brother who carved toys for his little sister. That love never died, never corrupted, no matter what else you became. She had children, Torvin said, staring at the carved raven through his tears. Astrid Freydis she lived, and she had sons, and they carry forward some echo of our family. They do, Ragnar confirmed, and they know about you now. I told them the story of their uncle Bjorn, the boy who loved their mother enough to spend his life searching for her. I told them that some ravens never stop flying until they find their way home. Torvin closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had been revealed. His sister, alive for years after he began his search. His sister, remembering him with love instead of resentment. His sister, creating a family and teaching her children about the brother who had carved wooden toys with hands that learned to kill in service of finding her. When he opened his eyes again, both Ragnar and Holgrim were watching him with expressions of infinite compassion. Why? Torvin asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Why did you travel so far in winter, risk your life when you are already dying, just to tell me this? Because, Ragnar said simply, I wanted you to know that the boy I saved was worth saving, that your sister lived and loved and left something beautiful in the world, and because I wanted you to understand that your search for her, even though you never found her alive, mattered more than you know. How do you mean? Your reputation as someone who could track anyone, find anyone, solve any mystery, that reputation reached even distant settlements. Word of the warrior who never gave up searching spread far and wide. Ragnar smiled through her tears. Your sister heard those stories, heard about a fighter called Ironhand who could find the unfindable. In her final years, she told her sons that she believed that Warrior might be her lost brother, still looking for her across all the years. She knew I was alive. She hoped, Ragnar said. She hoped, and that hope gave her comfort in her last days. The knowledge that somewhere in the world someone still carried her memory with love. The revelation hung in the air like morning mist, transforming everything it touched. Torvin sat in stunned silence, turning the tiny wooden sword over in his hands, while the carved raven rested in his lap. Outside, the storm was fading to whispers, but inside the hall, an entirely different tempest was. Building one made of 25 years of grief, finally finding its voice. You said you are dying, Torvin said at last, his voice barely above a whisper. How long do you have? Ragnar's hand moved to her side, where Torvin could now see she pressed against some hidden pain. The healers in the last settlement gave me until spring, perhaps less. The journey here has been harder than I expected. Then why? Torvin demanded, rising to pace again like a caged wolf. Why risk your final months to bring me this knowledge? What purpose does it serve to show me that I failed to save the one person who mattered most? Because you did not fail, Hallgrim interjected firmly. You loved her enough to never stop looking. That love shaped every choice you made, drove you to become someone who could search the world over. Do you think that meant nothing? It meant nothing to her, Torvin said bitterly. She died in slavery, never knowing that I survived, never seeing her home again. She died knowing she was loved, Ragnar corrected. She carried your memory, your gifts, your care with her through every day of her life. That tiny sword was her most precious possession, more valuable to her than gold or jewels. What could matter more than that? Torvin stopped his pacing and stared into the fire, watching flames dance around the fresh wood he had added. In those shifting patterns, he could almost see faces his parents, young Astrid with her golden braids, the countless men he had killed while searching for her. I have something to tell you both, he said suddenly, turning back to face them. Something I have never spoken aloud to any living soul. Ragnar and Hallgrim waited in silence, recognizing the gravity in his tone. When I finally understood that Astrid was truly lost to me, Torvin continued, when I realized that 10 years of searching had yielded nothing but death and disappointment, I made a decision. I decided that if I could not save my sister, I would ensure that no other children suffered her fate. What do you mean? Ragnar asked softly. I began hunting slave traders, Torvin said simply. Not just the raiders who destroyed my family, but anyone who trafficked in human misery. I would track them to their hideouts, study their patterns, learn their methods. Then I would strike. Hallgrim leaned forward, his eyes sharp with interest. You attacked them. I eliminated them, Torvin corrected. Completely. I would free whatever captives I found, ensure they had safe passage to settlements or family. Then I would make certain the traders never preyed on anyone again. How many? Ragnar whispered. Over the years, hundreds of traders, thousands of freed captives. I became very good at it, so good that the slave trade began avoiding certain routes, certain regions where the Ironhand was known to prowl. That was why you gained such a fearsome reputation, Hallgrim realized, not just as a warrior, but as something more, dangerous. I was systematic, Torvin explained, settling back into his chair with the weight of memory heavy on his shoulders. I would spend months tracking a single organization, learning every face, every route, every safe house. Then I would move through them like plague through grain, leaving no one alive to restart the trade. And the children you saved? Ragnar asked. I tried to return them to their families when possible. When that wasn't an option, I found good people to take them in, farmers who needed help, crafters who could teach useful skills, families who had lost children of their own. Torvin picked up a piece of parchment from a shelf beside his chair, one of many such documents that he kept in a wooden box by the hearth. Written on it in his careful script were names, dates, and locations. I kept records, he said, showing them the parchment. Every child freed, every family reunited, every trader eliminated. I told myself it was about justice, about preventing future suffering. But truthfully, it was about Astrid. Every child I saved was her, in my mind. Every reunion I enabled was the one I had failed to achieve. That is why you became a hermit, Ragnar said with dawning understanding. Not because you grew tired of violence, but because you had accomplished what you set out to do. The slave trade along the northern routes was broken, Torvin confirmed. Oh, there are still individual criminals who steal children, but the organized networks that once fed the southern markets, those are gone. After 15 years, I had eliminated them so thoroughly that there was no one left to hunt. Hallgrim studied the parchment Torvin held, noting the meticulous detail of the records. "How many children did you save?" 437, Torvin said without hesitation. 437 children who went home instead of living in chains. 437 families who did not have to endure what mine did. "And you think this was a poor substitute for saving your sister?" Ragnar asked incredulously. "I think I turned myself into a monster to chase a ghost," Torvin replied. "I became the very thing I hated, a killer who left trails of corpses behind him, all in service of an impossible dream." "You became a man who saved hundreds of innocent lives," Ragnar corrected firmly. "You became someone who turned personal tragedy into purpose that served the greater good. How can you call that monstrous?" "Because I enjoyed it," Torvin said, his voice dropping to barely audible. "That is the truth I have never spoken. When I killed those slave traders, when I saw the fear in their eyes as they realized what was happening to them, I felt satisfaction. I felt righteous. I felt like the hand of justice itself." "Good," Hallgrim said bluntly, surprising them both. "They deserved your hatred, and the children they stole deserved your protection. A man who could do such necessary work without feeling anything would be far more monstrous than one who took satisfaction in it." "You think violence can be righteous?" Torvin asked. "I think some evils can only be stopped with strength," Hallgrim replied. "I have seen too much suffering caused by good people who were unwilling to act when action was required. You did what needed to be done, and you did it well." Ragnar pulled a small clay vial from her healing pouch, uncorked it, and swallowed its contents with a grimace. The medicine would help with the pain, but Torvin could see that even this simple movement cost her effort. "I need you to understand something," she said once she had recovered her composure. "I did not seek you out to ease your guilt or to tell you that all is forgiven. I sought you out because I am dying, and I need to know if the choice I made 25 years ago was worth the life it cost me." "What choice?" Torvin asked. "When I found you bleeding in that cellar, I had a decision to make," Ragnar explained. "I could tend your wounds and send you on your way, or I could truly try to save you, not just your life, but your spirit. I chose to pour everything I had into healing a broken boy, knowing it might mean I had less to give to others who would need help later. You regret saving me?" "I regret that saving you meant I was not home when my own family needed me," Ragnar said simply. "If I had not traveled to that difficult birth, if I had not stayed those extra days to tend you back to health, I would have been in Bleakstone when the raiders came. I would have died with my husband and daughter, or perhaps my presence might have changed the outcome somehow." "You cannot know that," Hallgrim protested. "You cannot blame yourself for being where you were needed most." "But I can question whether the boy I saved justified the family I lost," Ragnar continued relentlessly. "Whether the man he became was worth the price I paid without knowing it." Torvin stared at her, finally understanding the true weight of what had driven her to seek him out in winter's worst storm. "You want to know if I was worth it," he said. "If the life you helped create balanced the lives you lost. I want to know if you became someone who added more good to the world than harm," Ragnar replied. "If the suffering you endured and caused served some larger purpose. If the broken boy I saved grew into a man who made the world better for his existence." "And if I did not?" Torvin asked. "If I tell you that I have been nothing but a killer and a coward, what then?" "Then I will know that my instincts were wrong," Ragnar said quietly. "That I chose poorly when I decided to save you instead of returning home to my family. And I will die knowing that my life's work was built on a mistake." The weight of her words settled over the hall like a burial shroud. Outside, the storm had nearly ended, leaving only the soft whisper of wind through the eaves. Dawn was still hours away, but Torvin could feel the night drawing toward its conclusion, carrying with it the most important conversation of his life. "What would constitute proof?" he asked finally. "What could I tell you that would satisfy your need to know?" Ragnar reached for the written formula she had been working on earlier, her final recipe for a pain medicine that had taken her 40 years to perfect. "Show me," she said simply, that the hands which once carved toys for a little sister learned to create more than they destroyed. Torvin stood and moved to the great hearth, where flames danced with renewed vigor from the fresh wood he had fed them throughout the long night. The sacred flame had burned in this hall for 7 years, never allowed to die, never permitted to fade to mere embers. It was more than heat and light, it was the heart of his sanctuary, the symbol of life continuing despite all attempts to extinguish it. "Before I show you anything," Torvin said, his voice carrying a weight of ritual preparation, "I need you to understand what this place truly is, what I have built here in my exile." He gestured to the hall around them, and for the first time Ragnar and Hallgrim truly looked not just at the immediate comfort of warmth and shelter, but at the deeper evidence of a life deliberately constructed around principles they were only beginning to grasp. "Every piece of wood in this hall I cut and shaped myself," Torvin continued. "Every stone in that hearth I carried down from the high peaks, every tool, every bowl, every stick of furniture, all made by hands that once knew only how to kill." Ragnar followed his gaze to the shelves that lined the walls, noting for the first time the extraordinary craftsmanship evident in even the simplest objects. These were not the rough works of a man learning carpentry as necessity demanded, but pieces created with the patience and skill of a master craftsman. 7 years, Torvin said, moving to one of the shelves and selecting a wooden bowl. Its surface was smooth as silk, its proportions perfect, its grain flowing like water frozen in time. 7 years of teaching these hands to serve life instead of death. 7 years of proving to myself that the capacity for creation could overcome the habit of destruction. He handed the bowl to Ragnar, who turned it in her hands with the reverence due a work of art. It was impossibly light, impossibly strong, carved from a single piece of what must have been ancient heartwood. "This is beautiful," she whispered. "This is the work of someone who understands wood as if it were a living thing." "Because it was," Torvin replied. "The tree this came from grew for 200 years before lightning brought it down. When I found it, most people would have seen only firewood, but I could see the bowl hidden inside, waiting for the right hands to free it." Hallgrim accepted the bowl when Ragnar passed it to him, his weathered fingers tracing the perfect curves with obvious appreciation. "You have found peace in this work." "I have found purpose," Torvin corrected. "Something I thought was lost forever when I realized I would never hold my sister again." He moved to another shelf, this one holding a collection of small carved figures, animals, birds, and human forms rendered with such delicate detail that they seemed ready to spring to life. Each piece bore the unmistakable mark of the same hands that had carved the childhood raven, but refined by decades of practice and transformed by hard-won wisdom. "When travelers come through these mountains," Torvin continued, selecting a small carved horse from the collection, "they often have children with them, cold, frightened children who see only a giant stranger in a place far from home." He handed the horse to Ragnar, who immediately recognized the same love and care that had gone into her wooden raven, but elevated to the level of true artistry. "I give them toys," Torvin said simply. "Small things to comfort them, to help them remember that even in hard places, someone cares enough to create beauty for no reason other than kindness." "How many have you made?" Ragnar asked, looking at the dozens of figures that filled the shelf. "Hundreds," Torvin replied. "I carve them in the long winter evenings, when the wind howls and there is nothing to do but sit by the fire and let my hands work. Every child who passes through here leaves with something made specially for them. And their parents? If they need repairs to wagons or equipment, I help. If they require food or medicine, I share what I have. If they simply need a place to rest safely, my door is always open." Torvin moved to a large chest beside the hearth and opened it to reveal neatly organized supplies, spare clothing in various sizes, basic medicines, traveling food, small tools and implements that might serve travelers in need. I have become what I wished existed when I was young and lost, he said. A sanctuary in the wilderness, a place where anyone can find help without judgment or payment required. The warrior's impulse to protect, Hallgrim observed, turned toward preservation rather than destruction. Something like that, Torvin agreed. But there is more. He returned to the fire and knelt beside it, his massive frame somehow made humble by the gesture. With careful reverence, he selected a piece of seasoned oak from the woodpile and placed it on the flames. This fire has burned for 7 years without dying, he said, watching the new wood catch and flare. In the old traditions, such a flame is sacred, a connection between the world of the living and the spirits of the dead. I tend it not just for warmth, but as a vigil. A vigil for whom? Ragnar asked, though she suspected she already knew. For everyone I failed to save, Torvin replied. My parents, my sister, the slaves who died before I could reach them, the enemies whose deaths brought no peace, but also for those I did save, a reminder that their lives have meaning, that their freedom was worth the price paid to secure it. And when you die, Hallgrim asked, what becomes of your vigil then? Torvin smiled, and for the first time that night it was a smile of pure joy rather than melancholy. Then someone else will take it up, because this is not just my sanctuary, it belongs to anyone who needs it. Torvin reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, smooth river stone, its surface polished to a gentle sheen by countless years of water and time. He held it up to the firelight, where it seemed to glow with inner warmth, and then placed it carefully in Ragnar's palm. This is my promise to you, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. Not just words, but a sacred vow witnessed by the fire that honors our dead. Ragnar closed her fingers around the stone, feeling its substantial weight and the care with which it had been chosen. What promise? That the life you saved will be worth the price you paid, Torvin replied, settling back on his knees before her chair in a gesture of profound respect. That the boy you pulled from death's edge will spend his remaining years serving life, not death. Hallgrim leaned forward, his staff planted firmly beside his chair, recognizing the gravity of the moment. You speak of vows. What exactly are you promising? I am promising to leave this sanctuary, Torvin said, and the words seemed to cost him something precious. To take what I have learned in 7 years of solitude and carry it back into the world where it can serve others. Leave? Ragnar asked, startled. But you have found peace here. Why would you abandon what you have built? Because peace without purpose is just another form of death, Torvin replied. Because I have been hiding behind my good intentions while people in the world below still suffer. Because the boy you saved has a debt to pay, and it cannot be paid from the safety of these mountains. He rose and moved to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtains to reveal the first pale hint of dawn touching the eastern peaks. The storm had passed completely now, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and cleansed by wind. When spring comes and you are gone, Torvin continued, his breath fogging the cold glass, I will follow the path down from these heights. I will seek out settlements where healers are needed, where children require protection, where the skills I have learned can serve those who have nowhere else to turn. You mean to become a wandering healer yourself? Hallgrim asked. I mean to become whatever is needed, Torvin corrected. Teacher, protector, craftsman, helper, whatever role serves the greater good. The hands that learn to carve toys for children can teach other hands to do the same. The knowledge I gained hunting slave traders can help others protect the innocent. The peace I found in this sanctuary can be shared with those who have never known such refuge. Ragnar opened her palm to look at the promise stone again, seeing in its smooth surface a reflection of the transformation the man before her had undergone. And if this commitment leads you back into violence? She asked. If protecting others requires you to become Torvin the Ironhand once more? Then I will do what must be done, Torvin said simply. But I will do it as someone who understands the true cost of violence, who has learned to create as well as destroy, who fights not from hatred but from love. That is a dangerous path, Hallgrim warned. Many men have told themselves they fought from noble motives while committing terrible acts. Yes, Torvin agreed, turning back from the window to face them both. Which is why I need you to help me walk it correctly. What do you mean? Ragnar asked. I mean, I want you to spend your remaining time teaching me what you know, Torvin said, returning to kneel before her chair. Your healing knowledge, your wisdom about helping the broken and lost, your understanding of how to serve without losing yourself in the service. I am dying, Ragnar reminded him gently. I may have only weeks left. Then we must use those weeks well, Torvin replied. Show me how to prepare the medicines that ease pain. Teach me to recognize the signs of illness that I might otherwise miss. Help me understand how to offer comfort to those who have lost everything, as you once offered it to me. Hallgrim shifted in his chair, his weathered face showing surprise and growing understanding. You want us to stay here, to spend Ragnar's final time passing on her knowledge. I want to honor the gift she gave me 25 years ago by becoming worthy of it, Torvin said. I want her to die knowing that the boy she saved will carry forward everything she taught him about healing, about hope, about the importance of choosing life over death. Ragnar was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the smooth surface of the promised stone. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been all night. There is something else, she said. Something I have not yet told you about your sister's sons. Torvin went very still. What about them? They asked me to find you, Ragnar continued. When I told them about their uncle Bjorn, about the brother who had searched for their mother, they begged me to seek you out if I could. They want to meet you, to know the man their mother remembered with such love. They want to meet me, Torvin whispered. They want to meet their uncle, Ragnar corrected. The man who carved their mother's most treasured possession, the man whose love helped shape her into the woman who raised them. But I failed her. I never found her, never saved her. You loved her, Hallgrim said firmly. That love echoed through her entire life, gave her strength when she needed it most. Her sons understand that. They want to know the man who made such love possible. Torvin stared at the promise stone in Ragnar's palm, seeing in its smooth curves not just his own commitment, but the possibility of connection, of family, of belonging to something larger than his own guilt and grief. When spring comes, he said slowly, after I have learned what you can teach me, I will find them. 3 months later, as the first green shoots pushed through the melting snow, Torvin stood at the place where the mountain path began its descent toward the settlements below. Behind him, his timber hall waited empty but not abandoned, prepared for the next travelers who might need sanctuary, the hearth banked but ready to blaze again at the touch of flint and tinder. The new path stretched before him, cleared of fallen trees and marked with stone cairns to guide future visitors safely to his door. Over the long winter months, as Ragnar's strength gradually faded, the three of them had worked together to create this trail, not just a route between places, but a symbol of connection between the isolated heights and the world below. Ragnar had died as the winter solstice passed, peacefully in her sleep beside the sacred fire that had warmed their long conversations. Her final weeks had been filled with teaching, with the careful passing of knowledge from her weathered hands to his eager ones. She had shown him how to compound medicines that would ease suffering, how to recognize the signs of illness and injury that untrained eyes might miss, how to offer comfort without false hope and hope without empty comfort. More importantly, she had taught him how to forgive himself, how to see that the boy who had failed to save his sister had grown into a man whose love for her had saved hundreds of other children. How to understand that purpose could be found not in perfection, but in the commitment to keep trying despite inevitable failure. Hallgrim had helped dig her grave in the little clearing behind the hall, where wildflowers would bloom in spring and the sound of the mountain stream would provide eternal music. They had buried her with her healing pouch, her few possessions, and the knowledge that her life's work would continue through the man she had saved so many years ago. Now Hallgrim stood beside Torvin at the path's beginning, his walking staff planted firmly in the earth, his weathered face peaceful despite the grief they both carried. "You could stay," Torvin offered one last time. "The hall is large enough for two, and the work ahead will be easier with a companion." "My place was beside her," Hallgrim replied gently. "With Ragnar gone, I have my own path to walk, my own family to return to, my own peace to make with the time I have left." They embraced then, two men who had found brotherhood in the sharing of loss and purpose. When they separated, Torvin saw tears in the older man's eyes, not just for Ragnar's passing, but for the hope he had witnessed in their final months together. "She died knowing," Hallgrim said simply, "she died knowing that saving you was worth everything it cost her. You gave her that gift." Torvin nodded, his throat too tight for words. In his pack, carefully wrapped, lay the wooden raven that had travelled so far to find him, along with Ragnar's final recipe written in his own careful script, and a small collection of carved toys he had made during the long winter evenings. At his belt hung the tools of his new trade, not weapons, but implements of healing and creation. They parted at the fork in the trail, Hallgrim heading east toward the settlement where his surviving brother waited, Torvin turning south toward the unknown. The first steps were the hardest, carrying him away from the sanctuary that had sheltered him for 7 years, but with each stride down the mountain path, his pace grew more confident. The world below was waking to spring, and there would be work to do. Children to protect, illnesses to heal, travelers to shelter, communities to serve. But more than that, there would be connections to forge the nephews who carried his sister's memory, the families of the children he had saved from slavery, the countless people who needed to know that someone cared enough to help without asking payment or thanks. As he walked, Torvin thought of the stories Ragnar had told him about her travelling years, the small acts of kindness that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, creating circles of change that touched shores she would never see. He understood now that this was how the world was truly changed, not through grand gestures or legendary deeds, but through the patient accumulation of choices made in service of life over death, hope over despair, connection over isolation. The sun climbed higher as he descended, warming his face and setting the snow-melt streams to singing with the joy of freedom. Behind him, smoke rose from distant chimneys where families gathered around their own hearths, beginning another day in the endless human struggle to create meaning from suffering, purpose from loss. Somewhere far ahead, 2 young men who had never met their uncle were going about their daily work, unaware that the brother their mother had remembered with such love was finally coming home. Somewhere in the wide world, other children faced dangers that strong hands and a compassionate heart might prevent. Somewhere, people suffered who might be healed by the knowledge Ragnar had died to pass on. Torvin shifted his pack to a more comfortable position and settled into the rhythm of the road. The path ahead was uncertain, probably dangerous, and definitely long. But it was his path, chosen freely, walked in honor of those who had believed him worth saving. The broken boy, who had hidden in a cellar 25 years ago, was finally ready to emerge fully into the light, carrying with him all the love and loss that had shaped his journey. In his pocket, the promise stone rested warm against his leg, a reminder of vows made and debts to be paid. Above him, a raven called from the pine boughs, its voice carrying across the mountainside like a benediction. The hermit warrior was coming down from his heights, and the world below would never be quite the same.